In May 2001, a quiet suburban neighborhood in Maryland was about to become the scene of a brutal crime that would remain unsolved for over 2 decades. A 48-year-old woman vanished from her own home on an ordinary Wednesday morning, leaving behind a gruesome scene that would haunt investigators for years. The killer walked free among the community, maintaining his normal life while a family grieved without answers. Only 23 years later would cutting-edge genetic technology finally unmask the perpetrator, revealing a truth so shocking that even seasoned detectives couldn't believe it. The murderer had been hiding in plain sight all along, someone the victim had welcomed into her home countless times, someone she thought of as family. Leslie Jennings was born on October 5, 1952, into a large military family in Rhode Island. Being one of 8 children meant life was never quiet or predictable. Her father's army service kept the family constantly on the move, teaching Leslie to adapt quickly to new environments and make friends wherever she landed. When she was 12, the family settled in Pensacola, Florida, where Leslie would spend her formative teenage years. She excelled in school, showing a particular talent for writing and communication that would shape her future career path. After graduating high school, Leslie enrolled at the University of Florida to study journalism. It was there, among the bustling campus life, that she met Carl, a fellow student who shared her ambition and drive. Their relationship blossomed quickly, and in 1974, when Leslie was just 22, they married in a small ceremony surrounded by family. 3 years later, their daughter Lauren was born, completing what seemed to be a picture-perfect American family. The young couple was determined to build a stable, successful life together. Seeking better opportunities, the family relocated to Chevy Chase, Maryland, an affluent suburb just outside Washington, D.C. This area was known for its tree-lined streets, excellent schools, and remarkably low crime rates. It was the kind of place where neighbours knew each other by name and children played freely in the yards. Leslie found work at a prestigious advertising agency in the city, using her journalism background to craft compelling campaigns. For the next 2 decades, she built a reputation as a reliable, creative professional who never missed deadlines and always delivered quality work. On the morning of May 2nd, 2001, Leslie followed her usual routine. She woke early, had coffee with Carl, and began preparing for another day at the office. Carl left the house around 7:30 a.m., kissing his wife goodbye as he headed to his own job. Leslie typically left shortly after, walking to the nearby bus stop for her hour-long commute into Washington. She was expected at the office by 10 a.m. for an important client meeting. But Leslie never made it to work that day. At 10:30 a.m., her boss began to worry. This was completely out of character for Leslie, who in 15 years had never been late without calling ahead. Something felt wrong. He pulled out his emergency contact list and dialed Lauren's number at university. The young woman was in class and hadn't heard from her mother that morning. Growing increasingly concerned, the boss called Carl at his office. Carl was equally puzzled. Leslie had been fine when he left, already dressed and nearly ready to leave. He tried calling their home phone, but it rang endlessly with no answer. A cold dread settled over Carl. He told his colleague he needed to leave immediately and drove home as fast as traffic would allow. Leslie's boss, sensing something was terribly wrong, insisted on meeting him there. They arrived at the house together at approximately 11:30 a.m. The first sign that something was amiss was the front door. It was unlocked. In all their years living there, Leslie was meticulous about locking up, even when just stepping out to get the mail. Carl called out for his wife as they entered, but silence greeted them. Then they saw it. The white walls of the hallway were splattered with dark red stains. Blood. There were droplets on the floor, creating a horrifying trail deeper into the house. Leslie's boss immediately pulled out his phone and dialed 911 while Carl, desperate to find his wife, began searching every room. In the basement, he found their dog locked away, whimpering and scratching at the door. But Leslie was nowhere to be found on the first floor. The 911 operator instructed them to leave the house immediately to preserve potential evidence. Fighting every instinct to keep searching, the 2 men waited outside with the anxious dog. Police units arrived within minutes, their sirens shattering the peaceful suburban morning. Officers entered the house with weapons drawn, unsure if the perpetrator might still be inside. They systematically cleared each room until they reached the 2nd floor. There, in the master bathroom, they made the devastating discovery. Leslie's body was lying face down in the shower stall. The position of her body told investigators a chilling story. She hadn't died there. Someone had dragged her into the bathroom after killing her elsewhere in the house. The amount of blood in the hallway suggested that was where the initial attack occurred. But what happened next revealed something even more disturbing about the killer's mindset. Forensic experts examining the scene discovered clear evidence that the murderer had spent considerable time in the house after Leslie's death. There were attempted clean-up marks on the walls where someone had tried to wipe away blood spatter. The kitchen sink showed traces of blood, as did the downstairs bathroom and even the garbage disposal. The killer had methodically tried to eliminate evidence, moving through the house with disturbing calmness after committing such a violent act. One detail particularly caught the investigators' attention. The cleaning pattern suggested the use of specific cleaning products, yet none were found at the scene. This meant the killer had likely brought cleaning supplies with them, indicating a level of premeditation that contradicted the apparent chaos of the crime scene. But despite all this evidence, the local police made a puzzling decision. They declared they didn't have enough evidence to immediately classify this as a homicide. They wanted to wait for the medical examiner's report, suggesting the possibility that Leslie might have fallen while cleaning. This decision would later be heavily criticised. Valuable time was lost and certain pieces of evidence, like blood samples from door frames, were not immediately collected. Meanwhile, word of Leslie's death spread through the quiet community like wildfire. Chevy Chase hadn't seen a murder in years. Residents who had always felt safe suddenly found themselves locking doors they'd previously left open, looking over their shoulders, wondering if a killer walked among them. 2 days later, the medical examiner's report confirmed what seemed obvious to everyone except the initial investigators. This was murder. Leslie had suffered 7 distinct wounds to her head, each consistent with being slammed against a sharp, hard surface. Further examination matched these wounds to the baseboards in the hallway. The killer had repeatedly smashed her head against them. Defensive wounds on her arms and hands painted a picture of a desperate struggle. She had fought hard for her life. Most disturbing were the ligature marks on her neck, indicating strangulation as well as blunt force trauma. The medical examiner also noted something significant about the timing of the attack. Based on the blood coagulation patterns and body temperature when discovered, Leslie had been killed between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m., a very narrow window that would become crucial to the investigation. The violence of the attack suggested personal rage rather than a random burglary gone wrong. This was not a clinical killing, but one filled with anger and emotion. With the case officially declared a homicide, detectives finally began their investigation in earnest. They collected blood samples from throughout the house and discovered something crucial: foreign DNA in 3 locations mixed with Leslie's blood. Most importantly, skin cells were found under Leslie's fingernails. She had scratched her attacker during the struggle, potentially providing the key to solving her murder. But when the DNA was run through FBI databases, there were no matches. The killer wasn't in the system. Investigators turned their attention to those closest to Leslie. As statistics show, most victims know their killers. Carl was the obvious first suspect, but his alibi was solid. Multiple colleagues confirmed his arrival at work on time, and a neighbour had seen him leave that morning, even noting that Carl had waved to someone through the window, likely Leslie herself. Moreover, Carl bore no scratches or injuries that would have been inevitable given Leslie's fierce struggle. Their friends and family universally described the couple as happy. With no history of domestic issues or financial problems that might provide a motive, the investigation expanded to include Leslie's co-workers at the advertising agency. Had there been any workplace conflicts? Any clients who had become too attached or angry about a campaign? Detectives spent weeks interviewing everyone from janitors to executives, but found nothing suspicious. Leslie was well-liked, professional, and had no unusual interactions with anyone at work. Her email records showed nothing alarming, no threats or inappropriate correspondence. Detectives expanded their investigation, taking DNA samples from male acquaintances, co-workers, and service people who had been to the house. Every single test came back negative. They explored whether this might be connected to a string of burglaries in nearby neighbourhoods, but those crimes were property-focused with no violence. They examined whether Leslie might have surprised a burglar, but nothing valuable was missing from the house. The killer had come for Leslie, not for money or belongings. The investigation also looked into Leslie's daily routine, hoping to find someone who might have been stalking her. They interviewed bus drivers, regular commuters, people who worked near her office building. They checked if anyone had been following her, if she'd mentioned feeling uncomfortable or unsafe, but everyone said the same thing. Leslie seemed completely at ease in her daily life, never mentioning any concerns about being followed or threatened. Months passed with no progress. A special task force was formed to examine 6 unsolved murders in the greater Maryland area, looking for patterns or connections. Could there be a serial killer targeting suburban women? But the other cases showed different patterns, different types of victims, different methods. Leslie's case stood alone, growing colder with each passing day. The investigation timeline was peculiar. The killer had a narrow window of opportunity, just over 2 hours between Carl leaving and his return to the house. Had the murderer still been inside when Carl and the boss arrived? It was possible. The back door offered an escape route that wouldn't have been visible from the driveway. The thought that the killer might have watched them discover the scene added another layer of horror to an already nightmarish situation. Detectives also discovered an interesting detail about the neighborhood that morning. Several residents reported seeing an unfamiliar van parked on a nearby street around 8:30 a.m. It was described as white or light-coloured, older model, possibly a work van. But despite extensive efforts to trace this vehicle, including checking all local rental agencies and business fleets, they never found it. Was it connected to the murder, or just a coincidence? Like so many leads in this case, it led nowhere. For Leslie's family, the lack of answers was torture. Lauren struggled to focus on her studies, jumping every time her phone rang, hoping for news. Carl threw himself into work, but found no escape from the grief and confusion. Who would want to hurt Leslie? She was universally liked, had no enemies, no conflicts at work, no controversial opinions that might have attracted unwanted attention. The randomness of it all was perhaps the most frightening aspect. Years began to pass with no breakthroughs. The case file grew thick with dead-end leads and eliminated suspects. Some in the community began to whisper that Carl must have been involved somehow, that he had fooled the police. These rumours hurt deeply, adding to the family's pain. Lauren stood firmly by her father, knowing the gentle man who had raised her could never have hurt her mother. She watched as grief slowly consumed him, aging him beyond his years. The family tried to keep Leslie's case in the public eye. They organised anniversary vigils, maintained a website with her information, and offered a substantial reward for information leading to an arrest. Local news stations would occasionally run updates on the cold case, especially on significant anniversaries. But as years turned into decades, even these mentions became less frequent. Leslie Jennings was becoming just another unsolved case in a filing cabinet, another family left without closure. In 2017, 16 years after Leslie's murder, Carl passed away from natural causes. Lauren would later tell people that he died of a broken heart, never knowing who had taken his beloved wife from him. She was now alone with her grief and questions, the only one left to keep her mother's memory alive and push for justice. Then, in 2022, a new cold case unit was formed in the county. Fresh eyes examined Leslie's file, and new technologies had emerged that didn't exist in 2001. The DNA evidence was still viable, preserved carefully all these years. The detectives decided to try genetic genealogy, a relatively new technique that had recently solved several high-profile cold cases across the country. They sent the killer's DNA to a company called Othram, specialists in forensic genetic genealogy. This method doesn't require the killer to be in a criminal database. Instead, experts search public genealogy databases where regular people upload their DNA to find relatives or trace ancestry. Even a distant cousin could provide the link needed to identify the killer. The process was painstaking. The first match they found was a man in Romania, clearly a very distant relative of the killer. From this single thread, genealogists began building family trees, tracing immigration records, marriage certificates, birth records. They worked backward and forward through generations, looking for branches of this family that would have been in Maryland in 2001. The genealogists had to account for adoptions, name changes, undocumented relationships, and other complications that could break the chain. They cross-referenced their findings with census data, yearbooks, social media profiles, and public records. Each potential lead had to be verified, ages calculated, locations confirmed. It was like solving a massive puzzle where most of the pieces were missing, and the picture on the box was unclear. It took 2 more years of meticulous research, but finally they found a promising lead. The Glicker family had lived in the area at the time of Leslie's murder. The name rang a bell with detectives. Digging through old files, they discovered something that made their blood run cold. In 2002, just a year after the murder, police had received a tip suggesting they look at someone named Eugene Gliger. But there was more. Eugene wasn't just some random neighbour, he was Lauren's ex-boyfriend. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Eugene and Lauren had dated for 5 years, meeting when they were just 15 years old in high school. He lived only a 10-minute walk from Lauren's family home, and had been a regular visitor there for years. Leslie had known him well, had welcomed him into her home countless times, had trusted him. She had even liked him, considering him a polite, charming young man who made her daughter happy. But not everyone had been charmed by Eugene. Carl had always been wary of the boy, telling friends there was something off about him that he couldn't quite identify. His instincts had been correct, but no one had listened. The relationship between Eugene and Lauren had ended when they were 20, shortly before she left for university. By all accounts, it had been an amicable breakup with no drama or hard feelings. Detectives discovered that Eugene's life after the breakup had been far from exemplary. He had been arrested multiple times for weapons possession, theft, and drunk driving. Yet none of these offences was serious enough to require DNA collection, which is why he had never appeared in the FBI database. The thefts were particularly interesting. Eugene came from a wealthy family and had no financial need to steal. It suggested a thrill-seeking personality, someone who broke rules for the excitement of it. There was another disturbing incident from Eugene's past. When he was 16, still dating Lauren, a woman had been attacked in their neighbourhood. She gave police a description that matched Eugene perfectly. He denied involvement, and Lauren had actually gone to the police station with friends to vouch for his character, insisting he was harmless. The case was never solved. Now detectives wondered if this had been an early warning sign they had all missed. Most telling was Eugene's behaviour after Leslie's murder. Just 2 months after the killing, he had abruptly moved to Washington State with his mother, putting an entire country between himself and the crime scene. For 23 years he had lived there quietly, staying off police radar, building a career in security system sales, ironically helping people protect themselves from criminals like himself. The 2002 tip about Eugene now took on new significance. Why hadn't the original investigators followed up? Why hadn't they at least interviewed him? The oversight was inexcusable, potentially adding 2 decades to the family's suffering. If they had simply taken a DNA sample then, this case could have been solved when Lauren still had her father, when there was still a chance for some measure of closure. With Eugene now identified as their prime suspect, detectives faced a challenge. How could they obtain his DNA without alerting him? They learned he was travelling in Europe for business and would return through the airport on June 9, 2024. A plan was hatched with airport security. When Eugene passed through customs, a border agent would pull him aside for a routine additional screening. Water bottles would be casually placed on a nearby table. The plan worked perfectly. Eugene, likely nervous from the unexpected scrutiny, grabbed one of the water bottles and drank from it. When he discarded it in a trash can, officers immediately retrieved it. The bottle was rushed to the lab, where technicians carefully swabbed the rim for DNA. The wait for results was agonizing, but when they came back there was no doubt. It was a perfect match to the DNA found under Leslie's fingernails. On June 18, 2024, detectives approached Eugene outside his apartment building. The arrest was quiet, professional. He seemed stunned, perhaps having believed after 23 years that he had gotten away with it. At the police station, Eugene initially played confused, asking what this was about when he had last seen Lauren or her family. He requested a lawyer, then seemed to change his mind, becoming increasingly agitated. When detectives revealed they had his DNA from Leslie's fingernails, Eugene's facade crumbled. He claimed he had never given a DNA sample, as if this technicality might save him. Then came the tears, or rather, the performance of tears. Detectives noted that despite his sobbing and wailing, not a single tear fell from his eyes. When called out on this, Eugene claimed dehydration, that his eyes were too dry to produce tears. It was a pathetic display from a man who had hidden behind a mask of normalcy for over 2 decades. Eugene's arrest sent shockwaves through multiple communities. In Washington, neighbours and co-workers described him as charitable, friendly, always willing to help. He had donated to local causes, volunteered for community events, seemed like a model citizen. But others weren't surprised. An ex-girlfriend came forward, describing violent outbursts where Eugene would punch walls and throw objects during arguments. His own brother admitted to being afraid of him, always sensing a capacity for violence lurking beneath the surface. For Lauren, the revelation was devastating beyond words. The man who had murdered her mother had hugged her afterward, had offered comfort while knowing he was the cause of her pain. She remembered running into Eugene shortly after the murder, telling him about her mother's death. He had embraced her, whispered, "I'm so sorry." The memory now made her physically ill. How had he looked her in the eye? How had he lived with himself? In May 2025, prosecutors offered Eugene a plea deal. He would plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for avoiding a first-degree murder trial. The maximum sentence would be 30 years instead of life. Most importantly for Eugene, the deal didn't require him to explain why he had done it. He could keep his motives secret, leaving the family without the answers they desperately craved. Eugene accepted the deal, admitting guilt but offering no explanation. Hours of interrogation yielded nothing. He claimed not to remember, refused to discuss that day, wouldn't explain how he had entered the house or why he had attacked Leslie. Investigators developed theories, but without Eugene's cooperation, they remained speculation. The most likely scenario was a burglary gone wrong. Eugene knew the house layout intimately from years of dating Lauren. He might have thought the house would be empty, an easy target for his thrill-seeking theft habit. When he encountered Leslie, she would have recognized him immediately. He couldn't let her identify him, so he killed her in a panic. But this theory had holes. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting Leslie had let him in willingly. Another possibility was that Eugene had gone there with violent intentions from the start. Perhaps he harbored resentment about the breakup with Lauren, and attacking her mother was a twisted form of revenge. Or maybe he had developed an obsession with Leslie herself during all those years of visiting. Without Eugene's confession, the truth remains locked in his mind, a final cruelty to a family that has already suffered so much. The police department faced serious criticism after Eugene's arrest. How could they have ignored a tip with his name in 2002? How could they have failed to interview the victim's daughter's ex-boyfriend? These oversights had allowed a killer to walk free for an additional 22 years. If they had done their job properly then, Carl might have lived to see justice for his wife. The department issued apologies, promised reviews of procedures, but words couldn't undo the decades of injustice. This case marked a milestone for Maryland, the first murder solved using genetic genealogy in the state. It joins hundreds of similar cases nationwide where this technology has provided answers to families who had given up hope. But it also serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of thorough investigation, of following every lead no matter how unlikely it might seem. For Lauren, now in her 40s, the arrest brings a complex mix of emotions. Relief that her mother's killer has finally been caught. Rage that it took so long. Disgust that someone she had loved and trusted could commit such a heinous act. And profound sadness that her father didn't live to see this day. She carries on, keeping her mother's memory alive, trying to remember the loving woman who was taken too soon rather than the violence of her final moments. Eugene Gligar, now in his mid-40s, awaits sentencing. He'll likely spend the rest of his life in prison, finally paying for the life he stole and the decades of pain he caused. But his silence about his motives remains a final act of cruelty, denying Leslie's family the closure they deserve. Some secrets, it seems, he plans to take to his grave. The quiet streets of Chevy Chase have returned to their peaceful state, but the echoes of that terrible morning in May 2001 remain. Neighbours still remember Leslie Jennings, the friendly woman who walked to the bus stop each morning, who never had a harsh word for anyone, who deserved so much better than the violent end she met. Her case stands as a reminder that evil can hide behind familiar faces, that sometimes the person we trust most can harbour the darkest secrets. But it also proves that science and persistence can eventually bring justice, even if it takes 23 years to arrive.